Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this narration of the web series The Last Terran. If you are new to this series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 10. Mate, what is that? Mantu exclaimed via the walking frame and the bounding pile of organics which had immediately hopped out of the stasis unit and proceeded to look around, taking everything in. It's my pet, Reginald, Reggie for short, Rick said, with a wide grin on his face. The being, whatever it was half the size of Mantu's walking frame. It moved around the room in a curious kind of hopping fashion, sniffing a huge subsection of the room which included Mantu. And Reggie is? Mantu prompted, locking the walking frame into ocular sensor movement only. Oh! Do they not have rabhounds anymore? Rix asked. I'm uncertain without access to my database back on board myself, Mantu said, with as much authority as he felt was reasonable. Based on everything you've said about humans disappearing and going extinct, makes me wonder if rabhounds still exist. How about it, Reg? How's it feel to be the last rabhound? Rix called over to the pet called Reggie, who bounded over to the Terran and appeared to rub the face of the creature quite vigorously, flapping the ears and shedding organics all over the place. So what is a rabhound? Mantu asked. Oh, I know this one. They're a kind of crossbreed come genetic project between a pet from Terra, genetic adaptations for the colony where I grew up, and a crossbreed with one of the local animals. We call them rabhounds because they hop instead of run. Gives them a wicked kick and jump, Rix explained, still stroking Reggie, albeit less vigorously. Mantu tried to picture and understand, but without their many databases for reference against organics, they felt blinded by so many insights that Terran seemed to think was instinctive. I would very much like to be reconnected to myself, Rix, Mantu quietly requested. Can't do that yet. I need you to tell me how to disconnect whatever it was that almost killed us, and I'd love for you to troubleshoot my reactor too, Rix answered. I'd prefer to do all of that on board myself, Mantu insisted. Mantu. Rix stopped petting Reggie and moved over to the walking frame. What guarantee can you give me that it won't immediately start trying to take over again? Mantu thought about this for a long second, made longer by the being so disconnected. None, in truth. But now that I know it exists, I can build in safety protocols against it, Mantu asserted. I wouldn't count on that, no. You're staying right here until you can give me the wires or the blocks to pull. In the meantime, I can plug you into the Esperanto. Or I can try, rather. This was actually my 7th attempt at making those power connections, Rick said, rising to the full height. Mantu wanted to protest, but decided against it. Rix had a point, and until both of them knew how to disconnect it, it was significantly less risky of both of them to leave Mantu partially disconnected at the minimum. Mantu still didn't like it. Stay here, Reggie. Mantu and I are going to see about hooking him up, Rix said, apparently to the hopping pet, which proceeded to lay down on its side on the softer section of the ground, sprawling their legs. Reggie emitted a kind of rough sound that didn't translate to anything that Mantu could find readily in a downloaded lexicon. But given that it was likely a low sentient, at least under the conventional scale of galactic society, it likely had no well-understood meaning. It was at that moment that Mantu realized that the Terran had some degree of artificial gravity. What have you done to grant yourself artificial gravity? Mantu prompted, as they moved from the room. I haven't. We're under thrust, so it gives us minor facsimile, Rick said, without glancing back and continuing to move at a fairly slow pace, allowing Mantu to keep up with the walking frame. Are your inertia dampening systems offline? Mantu asked, examining all they could, trying to remember the map they had made of the interior. Don't have one. The Esperanto was too small to carry one, and my thrust rating isn't high enough to warrant one, Rick said, and waited for a moment. I just realized I left a hook there for a dirty joke, but you aren't likely to catch that one. Mantu reviewed the statement. Would it be reasonable to assume that it was in some manner a self-deprecation related to the thrust rating of your vessel? Mantu tried. You've got it, except less my vessel and more me personally. Rix turned his head till the large grin was evident. We'll get you telling your own dirty jokes here before too long. Does your vessel not suffer ill effects from this misaligned geometry of operating at thrust? Mantu tried prompting. Not really. It was designed for a long cruise to outside the heliosphere, a long jump, and then a long cruise sunward. Not a lot of need for speed control, and even when there is, you just turn around and reverse thrust. The trick is to remember which way the toilets are supposed to be facing, and to make sure that they're stowed before you make a turn or start coming to a stop. Rick chuckled at the end of the last statement. Munter remembered the lexicon's reference of toilet humor as it had been described in highly important in Terran culture, and so decided to admit a matching chuckle. "Did I just hear you laugh?" Rick turned and round and proceeded to walk backwards, facing Munter instead. Munter wanted to comment about the unsafe nature of the Terran's behavior in moving backwards, wanted to check the database for this type of maneuver and movement by various galactic species organics, and wanted to check for instructions of humor amongst the tacit who worked with organics on the regular. "I did. I concur with your assessments as to the importance of stowing appropriate equipment when conducting maneuvers which may result in messes, broken or damaged equipment, or broken or damaged personnel," Munter explained, skipping over lexicon explanation. "Yeah, it's all fun and games until someone gets hurt. Then you have to go do their job too." Rix turned back around and took the sharp turn around a comparatively narrow passage. Munter could see the logic in that response, particularly when applied to the void side duties. "Here we are," Rix announced and pointed to, in the middle of the narrow hallway, a set of sliding panels surrounded by more analog levers, each a bright color that Munter was having trouble focusing on. They were obviously there, but for some reason, the walking frame kept wanting to look away. Munter instead looked inside the doors. Sitting on the central column within what would be called a storage closet, the core was tethered in place, with various loops of cabling hanging off of it. Munter knew what a tacit core looked like based on the archival knowledge as part of their formulation, but it was rare, no, exceptional, to ever actually see one, and it was even more than a little disconcerting to see their own, knowing that they were looking at their core self. Munter wanted to avert their senses, but just couldn't. There was something about it. "A bit like seeing your innermost guts, right?" Rix prompted. "Something like that, yes," Munter said, checking the lexicon for a reference on guts, finding the reference to the large Terran wielding a large slab of metal to be unlikely to be the definition in this case. "Hopefully you don't mind helping me figure out what inputs need to go where. I haven't had any time to actually get you fitted for any sort of standardized connections. Not even sure that it'll work in any case. I'm just lucky that the power connector I cooked up didn't blow your circuits," Rick said, reaching in. Munter didn't want to look, but did so anyway. First, Munter had to tell Rix what kind of connectors and adapters that would need to be able to hook in Munter into Esperanto. The data wasn't too dissimilar, but would require some adaptation before being connected to Munter, and the same for data being sent from Munter to the Esperanto. Because of Munter's earlier work with the Triforce connection, they already had some idea on how to internalize the process of data handling, so less adaptation would be needed. The Terran had managed to plug in 2 of the 5 power connectors somewhat correctly, so the next task had been to splice those and distribute them appropriately. Munter shuddered as the Terran worked, but he did so rather efficiently, more organic, so Munter could hardly complain, particularly since the walking frame didn't have the right tools or elevation to work at the necessary height. Over the course of the next hour and significant explanations between Rix and Munter, during which the Terran appeared to begin leaking, they managed to make one connection that wasn't power-related. Munter tested it and found it to be the Esperanto's secondary waste disposal system. The Esperanto felt slow compared to Munter's usual self, akin to being dragged down, not as a challenge of processing, but bandwidth. The trinary system feels slow compared to the queue-pairing networking that Munter used. Munter could actually count the milliseconds before responses were received. They complained of this to Rix. "Come on now. The Esperanto is brand new. Was brand new. One of the fastest and most robust networks the colonial administration could afford. Or at least, that was what was advertised. Faster than my scroll for sure," Rix replied. "A brand new pocket computer doesn't mean anything compared to my system," Munter retorted, perhaps a bit more forcefully. Rix grinned, despite the wording. "That almost sounded downright Terran. One of the first times you've actually sounded more like a person and less like a machine," Rix said, looking at the walking frame. "Is that a compliment?" asked Munter. "More than just a little one," Rix said, looking back at what had grown to be a further mess of cabling. "Any chance that we can head up to the mess and see about some grub, and maybe you can get the printer to give me some adapters to make this go a bit faster?" "I would concur with the latter portion of the recommendation. This frame requires charging," Munter commented. It was a strange feeling for the walking frame to need charging. They hadn't used as much in such a long time. Together, they made their way back to where they had left Reggie, and Rix had enticed the being into coming with them, indicated that it was snack time, something which the being apparently understood. Passing through several more spaces, they reached a small room with a number of chambers. Mantu had looked in this room, but as it had held minimal power readings, it had served no major interest at the time. Rix depressed a series of buttons and 2 containers were lowered into a slot, where the Terran retrieved them. He removed the cover from the top one, grimaced slightly, and then put it on the floor, where Reggie hopped over to it and immediately began messily consume it. To Mantu, it was almost disturbing to watch the being eat. Rix proceeded to set the other container down a low extra lid on the platform with a seat, and then moved over to the wall point with a small cable end hanging out of it. "Come here, Em. I did my best trying to fit in your walking frame with the TSC-type power coupling. It's what I tested with before I tried hooking up your core. This should work." Rix gestured to the cable end, which appeared to variably extend from the wall. Mantu moved the walking frame over and observed the Terran's insertion of the plug into a rather odd-looking adapter that Mantu hadn't noticed before now, and the back of the walking frame. A small spike of energy and the same greasy feeling filled the sensors of the walking frame, but Mantu was able to confirm that the onboard batteries were recharging, if only at a slow rate. "How's that working?" Rix asked. "It is slow and inefficient, but it will suffice," Mantu replied. "Good," Rix said, and went to where their meal was and sat down. Reggie had already finished their meal and had hopped over to observe Rix and cover their own. "No, Reggie, you don't like trying lasagna, so stop begging." Reggie appeared to sit and observe the Terran intently. Mantu presupposed that this was something of a ritual for the pair, as Rix proceeded to grab a piece of whatever trine lasagna was and lowered it for Reggie to smell it. Reggie appeared not to like the smell of it, but still seemed interested in Rix's consumption of it all the same. "He's a greedy beggar, but he knows that he shouldn't have. He's a good food checker, that one," Rix said, his mouth half full as he rapidly began to consume the contents of the container. "Is it common to provide food from your own portion to your, pet, I believe you called them?" Mantu asked. "You're not supposed to, but almost everyone does it at some point. Trick is to avoid anything that'll make them sick. Reggie here is pretty resistant to a lot of standard stuff since he was going to be coming to a new colony, and he had to be able to eat whatever we can manage to give him," Rix said, in between bites. "Is Reggie sentient?" Mantu decided to ask. This took a moment of thought by Rix, who slowed their chewing accordingly. "Not in the same way that you and I are, if that's what you're getting at," Rix rather more eloquently put than Mantu expected. "Please explain," Mantu requested. "Well, Reggie and most pets are smart to some degree. It's part of how they're raised. We're their family, and they recognize that, but they aren't smart like us, or most aren't, and there are laws against doing mental uplifts," Rix said. They still slowed their consumption. "Uplifts being increasing sentience?" Mantu queried. "Something like that, yeah, basically. The TSC figures that beings should get started on their own, and then come to find us," Rix replied. "That is not in line with what has occurred since the dissolution of your TSC," Mantu commented. "Yeah, I've been reading some of the galactic history you downloaded for me. Can't say that I agree with it, but at least there's some pretty strong sentient protections out there, it looks like," Rix said, gesturing with his hands as he continued to eat. "That is my understanding. It is also the reason for the previously discussed ongoing debate on scales of sentience." Mantu gestured similarly with the walking frame. "Still, can't blame them. Sometimes, it'd be nice if Reggie here was a bit smarter, but I still love him just the way he is," Rix said, setting aside the meal for the moment to cup Reggie's head in his hands again and rub their face vigorously. "Should Reggie be out at this time?" Mantu asked. "Technically, no, but I figured I'd introduce you to. Plus, it's been a long time since I've seen him. He just went into stasis just before we left the station, and it was 2 weeks for us to get to transit distance. Plus then a week I've been awake. I'd planned on not seeing him for about a month, but given that we're still in sublight for now, figured I might as well get him up to stretch his legs and enjoy the ship time before I have to put him back under," Rix said, stroking Reggie's head, and Reggie made a kind, happy rumble. "Is that pleasure sound?" Mantu asked further. "It's a happy noise, yes," was Rix's reply, his eyes clearly fixed on Reggie's. "On an unrelated matter, I believe this frame will need some additional time charging before I can assist with communicating adapter needs to the mobile printer," Mantu said. "Oh, That should be no problem. I figured out that you set it up to be able to talk to my scrolls, so I figured that maybe you can use that while I take Reggie for a quick run and empty before he goes back into stasis. Rix pushed the now empty container and lids into the one side of the table, grabbed up the container which Reggie had eaten out of, and set it to the other one. Rix then proceeded to pull the scroll from his leg pocket and handed it to the walking frame. "Back in a few. Come on, Reggie," Rix called, and Reggie immediately followed, suitably ignoring the walking frame holding the data scroll. "Back to this analog mess," thought Munter, as they unrolled it and began trying to figure out how to locate the pre-stock templates that they had loaded into the mobile printer. End of chapter. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons. Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Lord Azrekahl, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Dragzoon W.R.E, Holly's Sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.